Welcome to the Lifeline, a production of Simply BJE. The goal of this podcast is to build, inspire, and to empower our listeners through conversations on business, leadership, and mental health. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and at www.simplybje.com/The Lifeline. Now, let's tune in for today's episode.
What up, Doe? I trust that you are well. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Lifeline. We're your hosts, life coach and motivational speaker, Bo Powell, leadership coach and mental health advocate, Barry J. Elliott, also known as BJE, and yours truly, social media influence and owner of the For Real brand, Lindsberg Pettway. Our goal is to build, inspire, and empower our listeners through conversations around topics of business, leadership, and mental health. You can visit us at www.simplybje.com, The Lifeline, or on social media at Facebook and Instagram. Gentlemen, how you guys doing?
Doing well, man.
Great.
How about yourself?
Doing great. Great to be here. Great to be in great company.
Yes,
and
sir.
I'm looking forward to this episode of The Lifeline.
Yes,
Always
sir.
looking forward.
Yes, sir. We're privileged today to have Mr. Timothy Bowie, who has been in the building maintenance construction, I want to say 20 years. And then in addition to that, his focus is the affordable housing, which I think is great because that's a big deal. But more than that, he is a man of God. He grew up in church. He probably was like me. My home church pastor said that if they had maternity ward, I would have been born there. So he is a bona fide church baby. He's a man of God preacher. He serves in ministry there in Fairfield, Alabama. I believe that's correct.
Yes, sir.
And he also has his own podcast, which I'm excited to hear about. He's going to tell us a little bit about that later, but he's a man of God. He is a husband. He's a father. He is a social media influencer. He's a podcaster and so many things. So today we are privileged to have Mr. Timothy Bowie. Mr. Bowie, how you doing today, man?
Man, I'm doing well, man. Thank you so very much for the invitation, man. I'm excited for the conversation with you guys today.
We're excited to have you. So before we really dig into the meat of this conversation, tell us a little bit about tell us about your podcast, first of all, and tell us about how you got into the podcasting.
Well, before we
man.
do that, it's one question I got to ask. Roll Tide or War Eagle?
All right, so
Are you Roll Tide or you War Eagle?
we always roll tide, man.
Roll Tide. There you go.
I'm a real fan. I was there during the down years too. So,
Okay.
I've been on this train a little bit. So I didn't just hop on after we won championships with Coach Saban, you know what I mean? So I was there for the lean years too. So I'm a real fan.
So let me warn you about these two. Militant.com. Let me just warn you. Militant.
Hey, I'm all for it, man. I'm all for it. Man.
I'm the calm one, but these two.
Hey, man, let's go.
Those usually the
Yeah.
ones you got to watch out for, the one that proclaims the a certain characteristic. So
Right.
anyway.
There you go. It'll tell in time.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Anyway, tell us about your podcast, man. Tell us about how you got started, all that good stuff.
Yeah, man. So Focus Forward podcast just kind of came about almost as a brainchild. I kind of started doing some short form content, some reels and everything like that on Facebook and Instagram, and started to get some feedback from those who were taking notice to that content. It was like, listen, we want to hear more, and so after some thought and prayer and some of my consideration, I decided to go ahead and develop a podcast. So I've actually recorded one episode, and so I'm in the process now of getting everything back together so I can get on schedule to record more episodes and get everything out, man. So, but it's really just a podcast, man. We discuss life, leadership, and everything in between. So it serves as to be a personal uplift and, personal development, leadership development for people like that. So I'm looking forward to making an impact, man, on those who will take a listen to it.
Awesome, man. That's great. It takes courage to start podcasting because it's no easy
Yes, sir.
task. And it's really uncertain. So it takes courage. So I
For
applaud
sure.
you. As you have done the podcasting, what have been some of the challenges you faced?
The biggest challenge is being consistent with allotting time to sit down and actually record the podcast, right? It's very easy to get caught up in the cameras and the lights and all of the things that you think you need. Truth is you could probably just podcast with the iPhone and a ring light, right? But then you start to want to do better quality. So it leads you down the road of having to, looking at purchasing cameras and different lights and things like that. But ultimately it's about really taking the time and being intentional about allowing that time to record. I was talking with a young lady who helps out with our social media at my church, and she was like, listen, you need a content calendar. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, you need to be intentional, set times and dates on a calendar when you're going to sit down and you're going to develop content, you're going to actually create the content, record, and do all those things. and I didn't do it. So I'm in a position now where I'm being more intentional about doing that. So I believe I'll be better for it as I become more intentional and to get ready to get that information out.
Awesome, man. Much success to you.
Thank you, sir. Likewise.
So let's start this great conversation off. During our last episode, we discussed the Tyreek Hill incident on September 12th in Miami. What are your thoughts on that, sir?
Where do I start?
The beginning, the end, the middle.
Man, it is. I think it's very unfortunate, but I think it's also a reminder of how, as Black men, we have to be intentional about how we conduct ourselves in those situations. Could that situation have been avoided? Probably. Tyreek himself could have done some things differently to ward off some of those actions. But in the same breath, I am not excusing those actions either. I think some of those were very aggressive and excessive. But I think just with the tide of society right now, the things that Black men have to face, we just have to be smart. Choose our battles wisely. You know what I mean? I have a 16-year-old son who's driving, and he undoubtedly at some point going to have a interaction with a police officer. And my message to him is, you do whatever they ask you to do within reason. You need to live, right? And that can sound like it's on one end of the spectrum, but we've seen where those simple traffic stops have become fatal. And those are things that as Black men, we have to consider, especially raising Black children, particularly Black sons in this culture, in this society. I was having a conversation, and this was about 4 years ago during the pandemic when everything was being raised around Ahmaud Arbery, the young man that was killed by the two white gentlemen when he was looking through a vacant home. That rang home for me truly, because at the time I was a full-time realtor. And so it was customary for me to be in new construction homes when nobody else was there, checking it out for my clients and things of that nature. But I was having a conversation with one of my white friends, and he, we talked, and he actually broke down in tears because I started telling him, listen, these are things that I've been training my son on since he was 4 or 5 years old.
Right.
And, I don't think a lot of times that other ethnicities pay attention, or maybe they don't even have an idea of what it's like to have that conversation and to be able to train your children, your sons, with that kind of understanding and that awareness, so that they can simply just live past an interaction like that.
Yeah. And it's very ironic that you made that statement. I have 3 sons, 19, 17, and 13, and we're at least 900 to 1,000 miles apart from where I am and where you are. But we're teaching our sons the same thing because we live in America.
Sure.
The last podcast, Bo made some very direct statements about how America views Black men. And I went through some scenarios here in Michigan. And when I went to Alabama State, it was a little different feel down in Bama. You had to know where you could go and where you can't go.
That's right. Still like
but,
that.
But you kind of hit the nail on the head when we talked about this. The same things you shared, I think we had expressed all of those same points. Don't you agree, gentlemen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just as we talked about in our last episode, I mean, he hit it right on the head. There's so many dynamics, so many layers in that particular situation. Both sides could have handled that a little bit more responsibly with that. But I think, one of the things as you were talking, Brother Bowie, is just a lot of times we get caught up in what's right and how it should be instead of really dealing with the reality of what it actually is. And, it's right that we should be fairly treated as just men, not just Black men, but the reality of it is it's not. We're not. And so what you're speaking of, from what I gathered from it, hey, we've got a responsibility of how we manage, because we can't necessarily change that. That's just what that is. So we've got to see that situation for what it is and be able to deal with that appropriately while still addressing the bigger things at large to try to evoke change at some point in time. So I definitely agree wholeheartedly with that. It seems like it was just a carry on of what we were talking about in our last episode.
I think what jumped out at me, what he said, was he started talking to his son about this at age 4 or 5. And I'm just really thinking about how traumatic that is for a father to have that conversation so young.
Yeah.
Yeah. You say traumatic. I say necessary. I say
Yeah.
routine. And unfortunately, I say this all due respect, routine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost,
Yeah.
and it's almost necessary to have that conversation at an earlier age,
Right.
because sometimes it can bleed over into or start in school. A lot
Yeah.
of times in these
True.
certain areas, the administrator, the teachers don't look like you. So they have a different perspective of you. In the last episode, Bo mentioned about the responsibility of treating authority, the people that are in authority, with respect. And that is one of the things that have been lost in the last couple of years, or maybe 5 to 10 years I've seen.
Yeah.
And to that end, I live in a predominantly white area, white neighborhood. And so my son attends a predominantly white school. And so the preparation to go into that environment was very much intentional, because I understood, and my message to him was, listen, sometimes the friends that you grew up with, some things are going to change. Some friends are not going to be with you for the long haul. And it rang out true. You get to middle school, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, you start hearing the N-word thrown around, and and then that's when it gets real. That's when you say, okay, listen, this is how you're gonna have to navigate that situation. Yeah, you want to pop off and do this and that and everything, but at the end of the day, is that beneficial for you? Where does that land you? You start looking past the moment, and this actually starts to begin, I hope, to train their minds for when they are older and they are away from us, and they get to that 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old age, and they are, out in school or starting their own lives and things like that. So they know how to navigate those moments. Because, as a Black man in America, I believe we all will agree at some point, you're going to encounter it. It's just about when and not if,
and how you respond and how you respond to that. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
And I think it's important, why so early? Well, that's really when children are forming their personality and who they are.
Sure.
4 or 5 years old, that's that integral moment, or that integral period where they're developing their personality, their views, their perspective on life. So you have to instill that so it becomes a part of their identity and how they view the world. And it's just unfortunate that us as Black folks, that's a part of our reality.
Exactly.
What I'm saying? So that's the way it is at this point, while we're still trying to see some changes overall.
Right. So I guess you kind of answered the next question. From your perspective, who was in the wrong? Was it Tyreek? Was it police officer, the police department? Or did they both share some value in this particular solution?
From my perspective, I think right and wrong is a sliding scale. It's less about right and wrong, and more about how do you handle the situation in the moment. And I also, having friends, close friends who are also police officers, I also understand their plight also, right? Because they're going to situations sometimes blindly, and sometimes, a simple traffic, a speeding ticket can turn into a shootout. I saw the other day in Dallas, a young lady who's on the police force showed up to essentially an ambush. They shot her, a gunman came at her, shot her in the face, and now she's blind, right? And she only showed up because the officer that showed up initially to a call was shot and killed. And so she shows up as backup, where the gunman runs out, hits her, shoots at her, and she's blind now, right? So these are real issues that police officers are having to deal with. And I don't think that there is one set answer. I think there is a common goal that should be in the forefront of everybody's mind, is to let's conduct this in a way where everybody is safe, everybody feels safe, everybody is shown respect, right? Because even though, even if you're in the wrong, within reason, not showing any kind of violent tendencies, everybody deserves respect, right?
Sure.
And so in that particular situation, I think things could have just been done differently. Again, you have to know how to navigate. Communication is a major key. How do you communicate even when you feel like you're being offended, like you're offended, when you feel like you've been done wrong and disrespected? How do you respond to that in the moment, understanding what that moment could lead to? Right. And these are all considerations that we have to have in our minds, and sometimes have to process and filter in a split second, because you got to think most of these calls, they don't last 5 or 7 minutes from the time you get pulled over. They take your license, insurance, They say, okay, here you got a ticket, you're doing this, that, and the other, whatever. So these stops may not last very long, but in that short time of interacting with the police officer, you have a lot to think about. You know what I mean? And so, to BJE's point, he said, posed maybe it was traumatic to have to do that at 4 years old. I say it's only traumatic if you encounter that situation and you're not ready and prepared to deal with it.
Right.
At that point, it's a trauma because it's something that hits you. It disrupts your typical train of thought. You're not prepared for it. You don't have a response for it. And so at that point, it becomes a traumatic experience. So preparation sometimes can prevent the trauma. But that particular situation, I believe, just could have been handled different on both sides. I think they both own some level of responsibility for how that played out.
Yeah. And as you were talking, that's you hit that very word that I was thinking about is preparation. That's why these conversations are extremely important. That amongst men, but also amongst our young men who are coming up, our boys, our teenagers and stuff like that, so they can be prepared to know how to respond. But because if they, just because we live in the world don't mean you're actually present in it, meaning that you're aware of things that are going on. And so you might go into a situation thinking it should be this way. Hey, I'm a dude, as you should respect me, or just like I respect you. But if somebody hadn't prepped you on that and you go in there with the wrong tendency or the wrong attitude or something like that, it can turn into something that it shouldn't be. And then we're having different conversations, about fatalities and things like that. And so it's just unfortunate, as great as our world is, there are some realities that are terrifying to think about. But we have to address them. And I think it's extremely important. And so, but with that being said, and we kind of delved into this, but just as a African-American, as a Black man, Brother Boo, I mean, when you start to hear stories like that and see stories like that, I mean, what kind of things are just that go through your head?
Just the necessity of to be aware, and always, and you almost can't take a day off. Because you never know when you may be approached. You could be on a simple drive to the store. Anything can happen, and as much as you can't prepare for everything, you'd like to think that you're doing your best and your due diligence to be ready for whatever you may encounter over a day's time, right? And then also understanding, and I'm sure you will agree with this, but sometimes that breeds in itself a trauma. I read an article some time back that Black people are born with a level of PTSD, right? Sir. Because of stemming back from slavery, and they've done the science on this, right? Yep. And so, that kind of thing lingers all the ways. You know what I mean? I'll tell you a few. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood, and a few months ago, I wanted to go out for a walk after I got home. Now, I walk in my neighborhood all the time. Most times it's during the day. And I got home from work, got busy, and I got ready to walk out the door. It was like 8:30, 9 o'clock, and it was dark. And my first thought was, Black man walking in a white neighborhood. You know what I did?
Grab your ID.
Came back in the house. People in the house, right?
Wow.
You should have just grabbed your license.
Listen, man, and I don't blame anybody for that. No one here in my neighborhood has done anything to me out of the way, right? So I don't want to put that out like I'm blaming anybody. I'm just saying that these are considerations, that I have. These considerations as Black people we have to consider, because again, one bad apple can spoil the bunch. It doesn't take a lot of people to start an uproar. It takes one fool.
Now, let me ask you this, because of that statement, and I think it's because, and I can assume it's because you were born in a certain time, 90s, 80s, so we had a different perspective. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood as well, and this summer, my son and his couple of his friends, teammates, wanted to go for a walk. It was 11:30 at night, and they were out there hooping and was just having a good time. So we about to go walk. It's a big park across the street. No, you're not. I automatically jumped on that defense because of what they look like. But in their perspective, it's like, why? It's in my neighborhood. Why can't I go for a walk? So for me, the trauma was when my sons asked me, why? Yeah. Why do we have to do that? Why do we have to conduct ourselves in this perspective? And when we live here, we go to the same schools. Why? And, you have to give them the examples that I had to give them the examples that I've encountered, and also a history lesson on how this world was created, how this America was built, society. And because of that, they have a true perspective or a realistic perspective of it. Not true, because they didn't grow up in the city of Detroit in the 80s. They're in a cul-de-sac.
That's right.
It's
with 2 garages and an own bedroom and everything. Right.
Yeah. So it's a different perspective, different struggle.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that because, you guys are fathers, have sons, and obviously when they're at home, there's a certain level of protection that you could give them because they're in your care still. But as they get older, talk to us about what goes through your mind. What's that thought process like? It's like, as a father says, hey, man, at some point in time, he's not going to be here. He's going to have to be on his own. So what are some concerns or thought process you guys have surrounding that particular, character, that aspect of it?
Well, I'll say I'm not necessarily fearful.
Okay, good.
Because I believe that my wife and I have done our due diligence in raising our son to, number one, be respectful, to be aware of his surroundings, right? Because sometimes those things that happen, sometimes there's a way for you just to walk away and just get out of it. Being respectful, being aware, knowing your boundaries. If you don't feel comfortable, leave. I tell my son to, God gives us all a level of discernment. You may not understand it all the time, but if you walk in a place and you feel something, leave. Don't question it. We'll talk about it later. But that, and then also, I think those are two main things that you try to allow your kid, especially as they grow up and get older, become more independent, you raise them with. And also he's starting to see now some of the lessons that I was teaching to him at that 5-6-year-old age, right? Some people are starting to grow apart. Different, cliques are starting to form, things that people are starting being treated differently. And so he's starting to see some of those things that I told him about and warned him about start to happen in front of his eyes. And so that's allowing him to, number one, know I'm not just blowing hot smoke. You know what I mean? Dad know what he's talking about, right?
Yeah.
But then also, be sure that they are as equipped as possible, man. When they go out and they're driving. I heard Ricky Smiley say this, be sure you keep your license and your insurance information in the visor. You get pulled over, let all your windows down. Put the car in park, put your hands on the steering wheel. Things like that to disarm, situations like that. I'm a 305-pound black guy, bald head, bearded black guy, right? I look suspicious. I get it. I look suspicious, right? Broad shoulders, wide back, the whole 9 yards, right? I look like trouble for a lot of people, right? And so even in my own life, I have grown to know how to disarm people. To know and it's actually forced me to learn how to communicate with different people in a way that they are receptive of me without looking at me and seeing and believing what they want to see, what they've been taught to see at first glance, looking past the first page of that book. So, but I believe, teaching them respect and awareness is a big deal.
Yeah. Lindsberg, I see you over this.
Yeah, because he said something that struck a nerve, but at the same time, I do is we give them a pass. We take them off the hook. And when I say we, I'm not necessarily meaning all African-American men. And when I say they, I'm not talking about law enforcement. I'm just talking about people who don't look like us. And we have to put ourselves in a position where, like you said, we disarm the situation by yes, sir, yes, ma'am, opening the door or whatever we do, because we have navigated how to have them, take the tension off of themselves because they see me. I'm a threat because I'm just who I am. And my son called me tonight and he just asked for some advice. And the advice that he asked for was concerning a female. And I was happy to get the call from a 19-year-old. He's at college. And I told him the foundation of why he's at the university is to be educated, not to find a girlfriend. But the whole conversation gave me an opportunity to chip away and break the ice. But I was so happy and proud that he called me for my advice on this situation. Because sometimes when you're parent, you throw all these seeds and you wonder if they're catching them or if they're listening. I was a little concerned about him leaving the house. And that's just me being who I am, want to make sure my sons are protected or in a situation where they can succeed. But as he said, I did have, and I do have a level of confidence based upon how me and my wife raised them. Unfortunately, my son was in an accident 2 weeks ago. He ran into the back of someone. So he had an encounter with the police, and he was, by all stretches of the law, he was wrong. Okay, he ran into the back of someone, but he handled himself accordingly. And within the parameters of the accident, my wife was able to get there and kind of be his advocate and walk him through. America is different for us, and it has been shaped that way many generations ago. And as much as our children see it from a different lens in 2024, if you pull your glasses up, it looks the same in many aspects. So as a father, we pour into them, we teach them, we give them examples, and we pray that when they leave, they just follow what we have laid in front of them.
If I can be honest, there have been times recently where I said to myself, I'm tired of trying to make people of other hue feel comfortable around me because they're intimidated by my blackness, by my confidence. And after a while, that gets frustrating because after a while, because it's the same narrative over and over and over. So at some point, it does frustrate you. And so when you consider that, that's not, everybody doesn't have to deal with that, but we do. And that's been the narrative for decades. And it becomes tiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but however, I think it's, as you guys were speaking, the word that just kept popping up in my head was just emotional intelligence. Just how to be emotionally intelligent, how to navigate those situations, just right, wrong, or indifferent. No matter how bad it is, it's just a mature way you have to approach it. And it is frustrating, it's tough, it's tiring. But like I mentioned in our last episode, when you have a country it's built on white supremacy, where everything's defined by whiteness, if you will, until that changes, that is the reality of the world that we live in. All right. And so everything has been defined by that particular demographic as what's normal, right? What's suspicious, what's not suspicious, what's crazy, what's not crazy. And so that's just the reality of it. So, but before we close out, Brother Bowie, I want to give our listeners an opportunity to be able to find you. I know you mentioned it earlier, but tell our listeners how to find you, how to listen in on your podcast before we close out our episode.
Yes, sir. Again, thank y'all for having me, man. I really enjoyed the conversation. I believe it was impactful, and I hope somebody gets something out of this. But you can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at The Focus Forward Podcast 24. That's at The Focus Forward Podcast 24. We're all on all of those social media outlets. We're also on Apple Podcast and Spotify. So you can find us there.
Gotcha. So look, he's going to be easily found. So make sure you look him up. This concludes another episode of The Lifeline with your host, BJE, Lindsberg Pettway, and Bo Powell. Don't forget to check us out on www.simplybje.com/The Lifeline and on social media. Look, we're on a mission. We want to bring light and life into your household. So join us and let us hear your feedback, because it's all about bringing life to you on The Lifeline. Y'all take care.
Thank you for listening to today's episode with host, business expert, and life coach Bo Powell, social media influencer and entrepreneur Lindsberg Pettway, and leadership coach and mental health advocate Barry J. Elliott. Join us next week for another impactful conversation on The Lifeline. God bless.